Yeah, thanks for that overly generous introduction. I appreciate the kind words. And I'm really excited to be here today with all of you to talk about my book, Incarceration Nation. If you have any questions as I'm going through, feel free to let me know if something's not clear or you do have a question. And so what I'd like to start with is a look at the U.S. incarceration rate and how that compares to other countries and how that's changed over time. And so if you look, what we have here is the U.S. incarceration rate with Finland, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. And right there in the early 70s, the U.S. incarceration rate starts to go up, and it keeps going up. And it keeps going up and keeps going up until we get to the point where we are today, where the United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. And I chose to compare the U.S. with these Nordic countries because typically we don't think of the U.S. with these countries, right? These have larger social welfare states, different levels of spending. They're viewed as different than the U.S. But in the 50s, the U.S. incarceration rate was in between Finland and Denmark's. And so it's been over decades that it took the growth of the carceral state for the U.S. to earn the title of the world's most prolific imprisoner. And these shifts have led to massive economic, social, and political costs. And just to basically, it's very expensive to maintain the world's highest incarceration rate. And it's not only is it expensive fiscally, but there's trade-offs. So most of the spending comes from at the state level, where most states have balanced budget amendments. So if you're spending more on incarceration and imprisonment and corrections, you have to spend less somewhere else. So this matters. The social costs, obviously if someone's in prison and that affects them. Upon release, it's harder to get jobs, not necessarily eligible for all jobs, not a lot of training, job preparation going on in prison. But the social costs go beyond those incarcerated, right? We need to think of the families of those incarcerated. So there's about 2.7 million children in the United States who have a parent incarcerated. So think of the effect of mass incarceration on the kids who have a parent away from home, locked up in prison. Community costs, so the social costs. The political costs are quite impressive. Now, some of you may have seen recent polls suggesting the polls are at least implying a tight race between Clinton and Trump in Florida. Okay, so we're still a ways away from the election. We'll see how this plays out. But if that's close, like it was with Bush v. Gore in 2000, mass incarceration actually affects that election outcome. How? If you've been incarcerated for a felony in Florida, even after released, even after you've served parole, after all of that, you still can't vote. So the higher the incarceration rate, the more the effect on politics, because the more people who are not allowed to vote based on that. So there's massive costs here. Everyone's affected. So if your state government is spending more on corrections and less somewhere else, that affects you. But not everyone's affected equally. So you see the rise of the U.S. incarceration rate here. Who's incarcerated has changed. So in the 1950s, the majority of the prison population in the United States were white. Today, the majority is African Americans and Latinos. So as the U.S. has moved to a higher and higher incarceration rate, who is incarcerated has changed. And so minorities are most likely to be incarcerated. We also need to think of social class, right? So there's this intersection between class. So those who are from economically disadvantaged backgrounds are also most likely to be affected by the rise of mass incarceration. And it's really important for me to draw this out because what I'm going to be talking about for the next half hour or so is really thinking of mass incarceration and the rise of the incarceration rate as a macro phenomenon. So sort of big picture stepping back. And as I do that, it's important to keep in mind that there are individuals who are incarcerated, their families and their communities are affected, and although we all are affected by what's happened, it hasn't affected everybody equally. And so it's really important to keep that in mind, and that especially when we think of criminal justice in the United States, we need to keep social class and race as part of the conversation because, again, it's this outcome, what you see here, has had a disproportionate effect on racial minorities and those of lower social economic backgrounds. So what I want to do and what I try to do in this book is explain why the U.S. became the world's incarceration leader. And what I'm going to touch on today is three things. I'm going to talk about the crime rate, I'm going to talk about politicians and their involvement, and the public's influence. And what I'm going to try to do is give you sort of a brief sense of conventional wisdom. What have scholars said about these 3 points? And then basically say they're wrong. No, say that they didn't get the whole story right and try to add to the story and say that if we really want to understand the rise of mass incarceration, we need to think about these 3 points differently than they've been thought about by researchers in the past. And so the first thing I'm going to, so the main point of the book and the crux of my argument has to do with public opinion. And so that's where we're going to end up. But what I want to do is start with the crime rate. And Glenn Loury, who's an economist, expresses a sentiment that is quite common. He writes, "For 2 generations, crime rates have fluctuated with no apparent relationship to a steady climb in the extent for imprisonment." And if you do what I do when I'm trying to learn about something, and you Google it, here's what you find. And so this is a Google image search for crime rate, incarceration rate in the U.S. And it's blurry, you can't see the details, that's fine. All I want you to notice is most of these, you see a lot of X patterns here, or you see kind of a sideways V pattern, okay? And what all of these patterns from Google Images are showing is as the incarceration rate was going up in recent years, the crime rate was going down, seemingly moving in opposite directions. And this is what leads Glenn Loury and others to say that the imprisonment rate is disconnected from the crime rate. So here's a figure I put together that shows this idea. And the crime rate here is an index of the violent and property crime rate. Really, however we measure the crime rate, if I plotted the homicide rate, it would look the same. And I've scaled this graph so the minimum value and the maximum value of the 2 series are at common places on the graph. And I do that throughout because I really want to draw your attention to overtime patterns. And I've got some citations at the bottom. This figure is ubiquitous. It, kind of like Google imagery, appears in the literature. And it looks like crime and the incarceration rate are disconnected. And I want to suggest we need to think about this relationship differently. And the reason is, let's say some crimes are committed, people are arrested, and they're put in prison, okay? Now let's say the crime rate goes down next year. Okay, the crime rate goes down, so fewer crimes are committed, fewer people are arrested, fewer people are imprisoned, but most of those in prison last year are still in prison. So we're still putting more people in prison because not everybody was released. And so what that means is even if the crime rate went down and we incarcerated fewer new people, the imprisonment rate is still going to go up because we didn't release everybody who was incarcerated last year. And so what that means is even if the crime rate directly influences the incarceration rate, over time they can move in opposite directions. So there's a couple ways we could get at this analytically. If we had perfect data on the crimes committed and the number of new people admitted to prison, we could look at that. But a really easy, straightforward approach is to analyze the change in the incarceration rate. Because if the crime rate goes down and fewer people commit crimes, so fewer people are incarcerated, even though the incarceration rate will go up. It will go up by less than if the crime rate had increased, okay? Because if the crime rate increased, then more people are presumably arrested, more people are sent to prison, so the incarceration rate grows, but it grows by more. So the idea here, the intuition is, what we want to do is not look at this figure, but look at the change in the incarceration rate. So it's intuitive. Hey, if we want to understand crime and incarceration, let's look at the incarceration and the crime rate. It's what everybody does, but they get this view that they're not connected. So I want to suggest that we need to look at the change in the incarceration rate. And if we do that, suddenly things kind of line up like we'd expect. It appears that the crime rate is related to the change in the incarceration rate, which is exactly how it should be if the incarceration rate keeps going up because new people are arrested and imprisoned, but not everybody's been released. So crime's not the whole story. The crime rate's not the whole story. And we certainly, in my opinion, haven't had a completely rational response in our criminal justice system to crime rates. But what I want to suggest is we should get rid of the notion that crime and incarceration rates are not related. They are related. And if we analyze the change in the incarceration rate, we see this. And so then I want to think through more, well, how are they related? What's connecting them? But the first point is we should study the change in the incarceration rate, not the level of the incarceration rate. And when we do, the puzzle of why crime rates and incarceration rates seem totally disconnected seems to be not so much of a puzzle at all. The second thing, I'm going to connect, and what I do in the book is I talk about the crime rate in the book, how media covers crime, how that influences the public, and eventually I want to say the public has been a really important factor in the rise of mass incarceration. But anytime I talk about public opinion, I get the question, well, are politicians following the public? Aren't they leading the public? And this is really, a lot of people have argued it's the politicians leading the public. So Catherine Beckett writes, popular attitudes about crime and drugs have been shaped to an important extent by the definitional activities of political elites. It's our political leaders who are shaping public opinion. Veshla Weaver writes, public concern with crime is the tail to the kite of elite initiatives. So the public is following the kite. So I guess in this picture, that kid's public opinion in the Veshla Weaver story. And I should point out, Veshla and I disagree, I think, a little bit on this point. I agree with most everything she's written. She'll be here on campus on Monday. A really cool event called Educate the Vote will be Monday at 7:30 in Bailey Hall. And so attend that event, listen to what Veshla says, because what she says is always on point. And don't mention the kid and the flag, and the kite, I mean. But so she makes this point. She also says, and this is her just summarizing the literature, so lots of people have said things along these lines. The person to succeed in raising the public's awareness of crime was Barry Goldwater. And lots of people have pointed to Goldwater and his campaign for president and taking a tough on crime stance. Goldwater did take a tough on crime stance, but when I first came to this research, political scientists actually asked the question, how much do presidential campaigns matter for swaying voters? In fact, the political scientist Thomas Holbrook has a book called Do Campaigns Matter? And so we struggle with this, and it occurred to me, how could Goldwater be the one to raise the public's concern if I'm a political scientist and political scientists are supposed to be skeptical of any presidential campaign effect? Because Goldwater, even his closest campaign advisors said he ran a terrible campaign. He lost by the largest landslide in presidential election history. So how could somebody whose closest advisors say he ran a poor campaign, who lost by so much, be the one who set the public agenda? It just didn't quite resonate. And so in the book, I go into a lot of discussion of, did Goldwater lead or did he follow? I show using some data from the Roper Center, which is the world's largest public opinion archive on Cornell. It's both on Cornell's campus and is the world's largest public opinion archive, showing that the public had more confidence in Johnson's ability to combat crime than Goldwater. So I look into Goldwater, I look into Lyndon Johnson responding to public opinion, Robert Kennedy. But what I want to talk with you about is Richard Nixon, because Nixon's another one who's credited with focusing on crime and being tough on crime in his presidential election, and he leading the way. And this raises another question, because this was in Nixon's campaign in 1968 when he won. In 1960, he ran and he lost. He didn't talk about crime in 1960. In fact, if you go through his speeches on the campaign trail, the only time he spoke about crime was when he was talking about international affairs. And he was giving a speech off the back of a train, and he said, the way to deal with dictators is the way you deal with crime. And he points to somebody in front of the audience, just ask the sheriff here. All you got to do is show crime doesn't pay, and if you do that, we won't have any problem with dictators. And so he was essentially not making an issue of domestic crime at all. It's not a concern. And if we just reminded dictators crime doesn't pay, we'd be okay in international affairs. So this raised the question to me, why did Nixon go from being dismissive about crime, not even concerned with crime, to making it a focal point of his campaign? Because if he wanted to lead the public, why didn't he start in 1960? And what I want to suggest is he was following the public, and he noticed that the public attitudes toward crime were changing. The public was getting tougher on crime, and so this was a strategic shift. And so the way I got at this, so this is the top of a memo from an internal campaign memo from Richard Nixon's presidential campaign. And what you see at the top, it says Haldeman. So this is H.R. Haldeman, who was important in Nixon's campaign. You see a few other names on there. This is from Robert Ellsworth, who was his national political director. John Mitchell was campaign manager, who later became attorney general. And if we read down this memo, we would see an ORC poll conducted for the Nixon organization in February 1968 showed that race relations, crime and lawlessness, and the high cost of living taxing rated with nearly equal intensity across the nation. It goes on, the implication is clear for these key states. Nixon should campaign to manual workers on themes such as law and order that appeal to them and stay away from economic themes that alienate them. So they were conducting their own polls. They were reading the other polls being conducted at the time that were being reported on in the news and finding that crime and lawlessness was a concern to the public. This was different than 8 years before, and crafting a campaign strategy based on this. Here's another example. We see Haldeman's name circled. This is from Bell, a campaign ad, and it says all should read this. And it goes on to say, the last three Gallups, so these are the Gallup polls, have been remarkably stable in the spread between Humphrey and RN, Richard Nixon, between 40 and 42 for Humphrey, between 35 and 37 for RN. The gut vote then is leaning toward Humphrey, but this group is not happy. It is concerned in particular about the following things. Number one, crime. They are worried about the safety of their families. They are sick of the permissiveness in the courts, the city halls, and the administration. And so what we see here, and I found this in memo after memo, that crime kept coming up. And here they're actually worried that Nixon's behind in the polls, but they're calling it the gut vote. They can reach the gut vote if they focus on crime. And so this, to me, suggests that Nixon and his campaign were aware of public opinion and were changing from their previous campaign strategy to react to shifting an increasingly punitive public. Which raises the question, overall, if we think about the big picture, the incarceration rate, how influential could public opinion be? Well, the political scientist Kevin Smith writes, the increase in state incarceration rates is not a response to citizen attitudes. William Spellman writes, public opinion is the dog that does not bark. I think it's always a win for cute puppies on a slide, but I love it too. He's got the ball in its mouth. The dog can't bark, you know. He's holding on to this. So there's public opinion again, and the scholars Franklin Zimmering and Gordon Hawkins, the ad hoc reference to punitive public attitudes when prison population increases is analogous to the attribution of rainfall to the performance of a rain dance. So for this talk, I'd like to remain agnostic as to whether rain dances actually cause rainfall, but I think you get the idea here. They're saying punitive public attitudes don't influence the incarceration rate. So this is kind of conventional wisdom, and this is when I first started researching this book, which was at least 8 years ago. This is what I was finding, but for all of these reasons I mentioned, this seems surprising, and we could think about it, because there's a lot of ways public opinion could influence the incarceration rate. Ballot initiatives. So you've heard of 3 strikes laws, right? 3 strikes and you're out. So California, many states have this. California is sort of the most prominent example. Many of these laws were put in place by voters voting on the law. So the public has a direct influence. Elected officials, so this is legislators. So legislators determine the budget that goes towards corrections, policing, prosecution. But also in many states are judges and prosecutors. So in New York State, state judges are elected, district attorneys are elected. So there's an electoral connection to the criminal justice system. And I've also done a lot of work just looking at the U.S. Supreme Court. And if we look at Supreme Court decisions over time, the proportion of Supreme Court decisions that go in a liberal or conservative direction corresponds with whether public opinion is moving in a liberal or conservative direction. So this was kind of my theoretical perspective going in. It seems like public opinion ought to matter, but almost all of the literature is saying it doesn't. So I want to kind of explain where the literature is coming from and then try to make the case that public opinion does matter, and then I'll wrap up. So here's Marie Gottschalk, who's done a tremendous amount of important work on criminal justice and the incarceration rate. Depending on which aspect of criminal justice policy we look at, we get different indications of public preferences. So this has been kind of the dominant view. How do we even measure public opinion? And if we can't measure it, how could it influence the criminal justice system? Cullen, Fisher, and Applegate make the same point as Gottschalk. Support for Get Tough on policies is mushy. So I want to first show you why scholars have thought public opinion on criminal justice is mushy, and then try to convince you it's not mushy. So here's why scholars say it's mushy. So this is data from the mid-'80s, and have the courts been on the left too easy or too severe in dealing with criminals? 83% too easy, 1% too severe. Looks like a pretty punitive public, right? But let's ask a different question that might measure whether the public's punitive. Are you in favor of the death penalty? 66% yes, 25% no. Still looks punitive, but not as much so. Now let's ask a different question. So this is from public opinion polls, all at the same time. What do you think should be the main emphasis of most prisons? 17% punishing, 49% trying to rehabilitate. So if we ask about rehabilitation, the public seems in favor of that. If we ask about, are the courts too easy, the public says, yeah, they're too easy. It seems disconnected. It seems incoherent. It seems like the public doesn't have a coherent viewpoint. Well, we know from this, but also a lot of research, how we ask questions affects the answers we get in public opinion surveys. But what I'm interested in is changes in the incarceration rate over time. So that means I've got to look at changes in public opinion if I want to see if they're linked. So I'm going to take these 3 questions and plot them over time from 1970 to 85. And what I want you to notice, the differences here, main emphasis should be on punishing. This was the low one, right, where most people wanted rehabilitation. Courts too lenient, favor the death penalty. This is the different levels I showed you. But across this time period, the public's moving more punitive no matter how we ask the question. Okay? And this looks like a very shallow slope, but this is going from under 10% to over 20%. So in just over 10 years, the percent of the public offering the punitive response is more than doubling. So that's a massive change. And so what I am saying is, if we look at a single time point, which question we look at gives us a wildly different picture of public opinion on this issue. If we look over time, all three questions tell us the same thing. The public's getting more punitive. So whether you're a politician, somebody in the media, or the public, you're getting the same message, whatever question you're looking at. The public's moving in a more punitive direction. And this is how I'm going to measure the public's punitiveness. I'm going to take every question that might be related to whether the public's punitive or not that I can find, and it's going to be a total of 33 questions that's asked repeatedly. So each question's been asked at different time points because I want to measure the change. So I'm going to get a total of 381 survey questions and put those together in an index. So here's support for the death penalty. Here's view the courts aren't harsh enough. Here's the view we should punish criminals. Here's the view that we should spend more. Here's views of the police and the legal system. And then I keep doing that, adding 27 more questions. And you see how all the lines are kind of lining up and it's starting to get blurry, and I didn't even show you all 33. If I kept showing you, it would keep getting blurrier and blurrier, but that's the point. The levels are different, but the overtime trends, and this, I could just average these. I take a slightly more nuanced statistical approach, but this thick black line is what I'm going to call public support for being tough on crime. This is my measure of the public's punitiveness based on the logic of attitudes toward these questions are shifting in tandem. And so this is just narrowing the range, putting some confidence intervals around that. But this is what I would say is the public's punitiveness. So in the 50s, it was going down. Through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s was getting more punitive. And this is really important. The public's been moving in a less punitive direction. And this is consistent with changes we're seeing. So Hillary Clinton was really critiqued on the campaign trail for a mid-90s comment about super predators, and she's walked back from that. She's now talking about we need to have criminal justice reform. In Congress, we have bipartisan, some Republicans and some Democrats calling for criminal justice reform. It's as if they're following the shift in public opinion. So what I hope right now, at a minimum, you're convinced public support for being tough on crime has moved in meaningful ways, and that political elites like Richard Nixon were aware of and responsive to the public's preferences. And so now I want to think about how does this relate to the incarceration rate? And I suggested there's many ways it could. Direct vote on ballot initiatives, electing legislators, prosecutors, judges, even judges who aren't elected may consider their political environment, and is the public getting more or less punitive? And I've got examples in the book where I talk about, where I actually have judges saying they met with people and were told they weren't being strict enough in their sentencing. And the judge saying, I thought I was being strict enough, but I guess, I've got a position for life, but I guess I should listen to my community. And so I also made the case, if we want to understand what causes the incarceration rate, we've got to study the change in the incarceration rate, because if we just look at the overall incarceration rate, it can move up when what causes it moves the other way. And so this is the public's punitiveness, and this is the change in the incarceration rate. And you see they link quite closely. And one thing we have to keep in mind when we look at the change in the incarceration rate, the total incarceration rate is way up here, right? It's been going up and just started to dip. What this means is the incarceration rate was increasing by less and less. But that makes sense. If the public's moving less punitive and the criminal justice system's responding, it takes a while to slow down that growth. And it's just in recent years where the overall U.S. incarceration rate has dipped a little bit, has actually gone down. Now, what I try to do in the book is make the empirical argument with figures like this, and then those who are statistically minded can go to the appendix and see statistical table and statistical analysis. But I'm just kind of showing you here the figures, which is, again, what I tried to make the case with in the book with. And when I often show the U.S. national incarceration rate, people ask, well, what about the states? Because most of the incarcerations in the country are within the states. They're not at the federal, they're not at the overall national level. So this includes federal and state incarcerations, but what's going on in each state. And so I do, in the book, look at state analysis. I look at what proportion of state budgets are going to corrections. I look at state incarceration rates. So I'll give you one example. This is a measure of the percent punitive in California. So this is just looking at California. So remember when I showed you line after line after line of how I measured punitiveness for the public? I did the same thing for each state. And the statistical technique I used is called multi-level regression and post-stratification. It's an awesome technique, so all you need to know is MRP. No, if you have questions about that, I'm more than happy to talk about the nuances of multi-level regression and post-stratification. But the key is, that's how I'm able to estimate state-level opinion with the data I have. Now, this is changes in California's incarceration rate over time. And from my look, those line up pretty closely. And you see a bit of a lag, right? So here the public's getting less punitive. Here's the decline a few years later. Here the public's moving up. Here it's moving up. But it's pretty close. And again, I want to highlight the overtime changes, so I've lined up the scales to match with each other. But this I would like to present as evidence of, even at the state level, shifts in state incarceration rates are following shifts in the opinions of those in that state. And so to wrap up, Michael Tonry, who's an esteemed criminal justice scholar, has written, none of the conventional explanations for why American penal policies became so severe, rising crime rates, harsh public attitudes, and cynical electoral politics are persuasive. So my hope is I've convinced you a little bit that harsh public attitudes are an important part of the story here. And stepping back kind of big picture, again, the U.S. has the highest incarceration rate in the world, massive social, economic, and political costs that affect everyone, but not affecting everybody equally. I think public opinion is an important part of the story. One reason we haven't thought of it this way is by thinking of public opinion at a single time point, and public opinion looks really mushy. But if we want to explain change, we've got to analyze change. And once we do that, public opinion on this issue actually looks systematic. No matter how we ask the question, in the 70s and early 80s, public opinion was moving more punitive. Another key thing to keep in mind is if we look at the incarceration rate and the crime rate, they're going to look disconnected. If we analyze the change in the incarceration rate, they line up. And so to me, the full story that I try to flesh out in the book is, as the crime rate went up, media covered crime more, right? Because not everybody experiences crime. And so the media, the news media is an important part of the story. Crime goes up, news media is covering rising crime. This is what's pushing the public in a more punitive direction. But if the public's not moving in a more punitive direction, politicians aren't responding the same way. And we see Nixon noticing the public. Nixon's not citing crime statistics, he's citing public opinion. That leads the politicians, the criminal justice system, to change. And that's what begins changing the laws, the sentencing requirement, how we classify crimes, how much we spend on the correction system. Those political decisions are a reaction to the shifting public attitudes. And this gives us the relationship between punitive attitudes and the change in the incarceration rate. But again, we see the growth of the carceral state slowed as the public became less punitive and has actually been moving down as the public's been moving in a less punitive direction. And given the closure of some prisons that we've seen, given the decriminalization of some drug crimes, the beginning of conversations of actual bipartisan calls for criminal justice reform, I'm at least cautiously optimistic. And especially in the sense, if we recognize it was the public who brought us to this point of being the world's incarceration leader, it is also us as the public who has the power to move us in a new direction. So I'll end with that, and thank you. So I think I see some hands and there's a microphone coming around.
Hi, I was just curious about something. So if I got it right, the change in incarceration rate has to do with the change on how public perceive, on how public's opinion and how punitive it gets this opinion. But what does your research have to say about the composition of the prisons? Given that 80% of the people, I think, in prison are black or I don't know, and the rest are Latinos pretty much,
yeah.
Does this mean that the public is biased or how do we read that? And the second part of my question would be, what is your take on a research of a scholar like Michelle Alexander? Does your research has anything to say with the new Jim Crow, this concept that she has brought up lately?
Yeah, great. So terrific question. So one, with just Michelle Alexander and the new Jim Crow. So first of all, terrific book. And one of the key points, so I think in terms of how we got to where we are, I think we have kind of a different vision. But in terms of a key point of her book is highlighting the racial implications of the carceral state in the US. And I think she's right on. I mean, that's the title, The New Jim Crow. And I think drawing attention, scholarly attention, public attention to the racial implications of criminal justice policy in the United States, she's right on and really important. And she's not the only one who's done that, but really important. And yeah, about African Americans and Latinos make up 55–60% of the prison population. So a couple things with public opinion. It's complicated. Racial biases correlate with punitive attitudes, right? And so when those who are more likely to express racial prejudice in a survey response are more likely to express more punitive attitudes. There's also studies with implicit reactions. So if you see the sort of prime racial considerations and then show images of people and are they holding a book or a gun, the sort of implicit racial reaction. So race matters in important ways, and racial prejudice matters for punitiveness. And one thing of the questions I showed you, I didn't measure in my index of punitiveness racial prejudice, racial bias. Why not? Because in surveys, there's a social desirability bias. So even somebody who might internally harbor biased attitudes won't express it. But they will say they favor the death penalty, or they will say courts are too easy, too lenient on criminals. And so I argue that my measure is actually incorporating any racial bias that exists in public opinion. So by not asking directly about it, I can't tell you what proportion of my measure comes from racial bias, but it's incorporating it because if the reason somebody favors the death penalty is because of racial bias, by knowing they favor it, or by knowing more of the public favors it, I have that. But another really interesting fact, I've disaggregated that measure of punitiveness by racial group. And in the 60s, 70s, 80s, when the public's moving more punitive, whites as a group tend to be more punitive than African Americans as a group, but both groups are moving in a more punitive direction. And this is something else we have to keep in mind when we're trying to understand the role of public opinion. It's not just what percent of a group is punitive or not punitive or favors rehabilitation or doesn't, but how are the groups moving? Because if every group's moving in a more punitive direction, policymakers actually win votes by shifting in that direction because every group's getting more people. And so the direction of opinion change is really important there. Yeah, great questions.
So my question is I think I disagreed until I heard what you just said there. Now I'm sort of leaning in your camp. What gets me is the motivation for this shift in public opinion. And the reason I thought of that is because you said 1960, not mentioned, Voting Rights Act 1965, Barry Goldwater 1964.
Yep.
Now you have a shift in the Republican Party's propaganda. And then you see that through the 70s and through the 80s pushing public opinion. So the question is, do you believe that the public opinion was motivating this propaganda, or propaganda is put in place to shift public opinion?
Yeah, great question and great emphasis on the historical climate, right? Because I'm sort of taking this macro view, like let's think of 60 years and try to condense 60 years into 30 minutes. But yeah, the historical time period, really important, in the 60s especially, a very tumultuous time. So I would say a couple things. One, different forces reinforce each other for sure. So you can imagine Nixon taking a poll, following the public, and then making a speech, and that reinforcing. What stunned me is I consistently found evidence of politicians and policy following the public, whether I look sort of statistically or just anecdotally. It was hard to find it the other way. And one example is the public, so the American National Election Study asks every presidential election, who are you going to vote for, why are you going to vote? And it's an open-ended question. And they code what people said. They break it into really finite categories. So there's responses of, oh, I like Barry Goldwater's farm policy, or I like what he's going to do, and some people said, I won't vote for him because his view on race. I vote for him out of the 88 categories, not one mentioned crime. So voters weren't talking about supporting or opposing Goldwater because of crime. He was talking about crime. The public was starting to become concerned with crime, but voters weren't saying that's why they like Goldwater. So it was very hard to find any evidence. But of course, I believe forces politicians say something that's going to influence the public. That's why they say it. Oftentimes, the public says something that influences politicians. So it is a two-way street. Over and over again, it seems like there's much more traffic going from the public to the political world than back on this issue. But the other thing is the crime rate. It's stunning how accurate news covers crime over time. And that should sort of raise some red flags because we kind of think, we know the news doesn't cover crime accurately. They over-report violent crimes. The news over-reports crimes committed by racial minorities. But it turns out these biases are relatively constant. They've been going on for a long time. So if a bias is constant, when crime goes up, the bias stays, more reporting on crime. And when crime goes down, less reporting on crime. And so the over time correlation between the crime rate and news coverage of crime is really high, even though the news is always over-reporting violent crime. And it's because of that bias is so consistent that holds up. And so it really, if we dig into the data, it's the crime rate being reported that's influencing public attitudes. Now, if there weren't riots in the streets in the 60s, would news have covered crime differently? And that's really important. Because imagine crime goes up, the news could start saying crime's going up, here are these new policy proposals to address the roots of crime. But if crime's going up and there's riots in the street and it's crimes, you should be scared of crime. So how news covers crime may be more influenced by the historical context than how much, if that links in. But really, really important, I like sort of being pushed toward the historical context and the nuance because it matters immensely. Totally agree, love it.
I
I want to go along with that. I was in college in the 60s. I went to graduate school in 1969, and we only had a few TV stations, and they showed a very violent, was not crime they were showing that was violent. They were showing the race riots. They were showing people, and I remember people in the rural saying, why are they burning down their own neighborhoods? They didn't understand everything that had happened since the Civil War and all the that it was culminating in the civil rights movement. They didn't understand that. They just saw black people going crazy, what they thought was going crazy. And so I believe that 1971, it's related directly to the civil rights movement. And I think saying being tough on crime is one of the code words Nixon used to say don't let these black people riot and get things. I think he's using code words with crime. I think they've all used it since then. And that's my opinion. I mean, even in Kent State, I was in graduate school at Kent State, and people were saying they wished it was their kids that were shot. I mean, there was a huge, and Malcolm X was on TV, but we only had a few stations. My family had one TV station. We saw Malcolm X, that angry Malcolm X, and the news people were all, belittling and criticizing. I think the news media had a big part in it. But I agree, it was public opinion, but it's public opinion what they saw.
Yeah, no, I think we have to keep in mind those historical moments and those images, and they're powerful. And I would even say, if those images didn't occur or happened differently, we could envision an alternate sort of history unfolding. But the one thing I think we need to keep in mind is sort of, here's when the public starts getting more punitive, and it keeps going up through the mid-90s. And so this time period of the 60s is certainly important, but there's also a risk of focusing sort of all the causal explanation there, because crime kept going up too. And so if the crime didn't keep going up, we wouldn't have an expectation of the public moving more punitive. Or we could think of it differently. If crime kept going up, but news covered it differently, there doesn't have to be a link between the crime rate and the public's punitiveness over time. But if the news covers crime in the same way over and over again, that link will be there. And so I want to acknowledge the importance of these events in the mid-60s, but also point out this relationship is pretty strong and consistent throughout the entire 60 years. And I think that matters for how we think about criminal justice reform, because if it's a story of the 60s and how political elites reacted to the 60s and framed it in the 60s, it's really hard to think about how to change the criminal justice system. But if it's a story of the public has some agency and the public's been moving in a less punitive direction, and we're already seeing evidence of the criminal justice system responding, that says, hey, let's focus the public energies, let's hold news accountable for covering crime in not such a sensationalistic way, and we can actually expect to see change and feel some agency, as opposed to what was done, and those events unfolded, and we don't have any control. But I really agree with a lot of important points there.
Hi. Well, I wasn't around in the 60s, but I think I would at least make an argument that possibly, or maybe I would just parrot Elizabeth Hinton's argument that I think that they're important. I'm not sure if you've read her book that came out in May, but she at least made the argument that crime statistics were in large part, and the rise in crime rates was a result of new technologies and logics of the measurement of and the production of criminality from a state perspective, of the historical moment of new statistical software of computerized crime measurements. I mean, I was wondering if you could talk a bit about your thoughts on the crime rate and how the state measures criminality and can produce new forms of criminality by designating new acts as criminal, and how that might relate to a shifting crime rate, and if that might be also a product of the 1960s, because it seems like that could also be an intersection for policy intervention of how we measure crime and think about crime rather than necessarily public opinion on punitivity.
Yeah, great, because I'm giving the crime rate sort of a causal element, saying that influenced the news, that influenced the public. So if, if the statistics are bogus, then it all falls apart. So I love this question. A couple of points here. Certainly how we define crime matters. So Colorado legalizes marijuana, so what was a crime isn't a crime. That's going to affect our statistics. One thing I've done, so how we define crime will matter. Our ability to report, if a small town can now afford computers and document things better, that's going to affect reporting. But a couple things. One, I look at homicide rates a lot, which have been validated by death certificates. So the homicide rate that's available has been validated and actually seems quite accurate. So that's, sort of most people trust that. The other thing that's interesting is crime rates differ. There's more larceny than homicides, but they tend to move together. And they tend to move together not only different types of crime, meaning going up or going down at the same time, but in different cities. I show this in the book, and different states. And so what that kind of means for my argument is if all of the data are moving together and they're all pretty much tracking the homicide rate, which we've validated statistically, there are going to be errors in the measurement, but the errors aren't driving the movements. Because if the errors were driving it, we'd see something like step functions instead of over time moving together. So I think that gives me more confidence than some scholars have. The other thing I want to point out is because we know the crime rate, according to these statistics, has been going down. And so it gets really tricky if somebody critiques the crime rate going up. We can't trust the data. It raises this question, sort of this kind of almost Pandora's box. Well, can we trust that the crime rate's been going down? Because a lot of people, I could put it this way, a lot of people want to say the crime rate's been going down. We need to incarcerate less, spend less on corrections, but if we don't trust the data, if we don't trust the data when it shows the crime rate's going up, we can't trust the data when it shows the crime rate's going down. Because we validated the homicide data and because crime data of all types tend to move together, I feel relatively confident in that. Crime rates right now are really interesting because we've got some evidence of cities' homicide rates going up. It's a mix. And so for me, I'm very concerned because historically, as I've said, the news is, however the crime rate's gone, is the way the news has gone, which is the way the public's gone, which is the way the criminal justice system's gone. So if the crime rate does start creeping up, and again, the homicide rate we have really valid data for and reliable data, if it starts creeping up in the next couple of years, either news needs to cover it differently and not just focus on it in a sensationalistic way, but talk about why is it going up, how do we change this, and really report on it in a broad way. Or I'm very concerned that the reforms we're sort of on the cusp of and beginning to see could go back. So I really look for the crime rate as a barometer of which way the criminal justice system's going.
Okay, I'm seeing a bunch, and I think we can probably do two more. Let me get over this side of the room where we haven't been very much.
So my question is that with all the biases, like with all the bias and like the over-exaggerated media coverage, how are the incarceration rates of minorities expected to decrease? Because even if the incarceration rates itself decreases, we can't guarantee that like minorities will not still be the majority in prison.
So that's a great point of not just talking about the numbers of overall incarceration, but who. And I would say a couple of things. So one, we need to rethink support we give to those who have been incarcerated when they leave prison. Because the overwhelming majority of those incarcerated today will be released. And released into an environment where it's very difficult to, resettle in the community, find a job, that we need to offer that support. And if we do that as a society and institute the relevant social programs And Cornell has a prison education program that I've been involved with, and that type of program, but at a broader scale, then what that's going to do is reduce recidivism. Because there's a majority of racial minorities in prison, that's going to help address that bias. The other thing we have is there are biases in the criminal justice system, racial biases. Some of these have been, you may have heard of different sentencing between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. And at the federal level, that's been addressed and equalized. But for years upon years, the equivalent amount of crack and powder cocaine carry different sentences. Why does that matter? Because if you look at who's imprisoned for which type of drug, it's high 80% of those imprisoned for crack cocaine are African American. And that's not me saying African Americans are more likely to use crack cocaine. That's me saying the data show they're more likely to be arrested and imprisoned for crack cocaine. So that was codified into the law that had a built-in racial disparity. So there's been some, again, at the federal level, that's been addressed. So identifying aspects of the law that builds in racial biases has to change. And then there's also implicit racial biases that have to be talked about, have to be addressed. And so basically, on the input side of how the justice system is sort of in terms of arrest, prosecution, and then on the recidivism side. So on both sides, racial disparities and biases. And I would bring in class disparities and biases too. Because we know if you can afford a lawyer, it's going to have a different probability on the outcome of your interaction with the judicial system than if you can't.
Thank you for a great talk. One thing that I guess you kind of touched on very briefly was that a lot of the trends that you saw were pretty consistent across the U.S. But I was wondering if you could maybe talk about the urban-rural divide, and if you saw any interesting trends with respect to perhaps urban public support for being tough on crime versus rural. And also, I don't know if your research really touched on this, but perhaps the types of crimes and the changes in the types of crimes and what people were really being arrested for in urban areas versus rural areas.
Yeah, no, great. So urban, rural, important divides. I haven't looked a lot at that. One reason is I looked at urban areas because they're the most populous. The other is in terms of trying to understand the media connection between the crime rate and public opinion. Urban areas is where the newspapers are, where the local television is. So that's why I was doing mostly comparing across urban areas. And so I haven't looked at that, but it's really a fascinating topic to think about, differences. My prediction, I did do urban-rural over time, and again, we see similar trends, but looking into that more concretely is a really interesting idea. And the types of crime and how they're spoken about in the media are really interesting. So in the 50s, it's a lot of juveniles, but there's concerns with the heroin epidemic. There was some concerns with crime being depicted in comic books. And so the kind of scope of what crime's drawing attention is changing. But again, the way the larceny rate goes up and down, when the homicide rate goes up and down, when car theft goes up and down. And I think that makes sense in terms of broad social conditions shifting, have a big influence on all types of crime. It's not the only cause, but has a big influence. But the rural-urban comparison is something, maybe that's the next book.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Professor Enns and suggest that we can continue the conversations back at the Buffalo Street Books table.
Great. Thanks so much.